Ricardo Klement walks alone through the shadows of San Fernando, Argentina. His home glows faintly in the distance, his family waiting inside. But just before he reaches the gate, hands seize him from behind. A violent struggle breaks out as Klement pushes and kicks at the men, dragging him to a parked car. Within seconds, he's pinned to the floor of the vehicle as his captors bark questions. Klement stops resisting and instead mutters coldly in German, quote, "I'm already resigned to my fate." His captors have searched through cloistered monasteries, followed his trail into remote villages, and chased faint leads across guarded borders. Klement is no ordinary fugitive, and behind the facade of a quiet family man lies the mastermind behind one of the greatest crimes the world has ever seen. For years, he's been shielded by a clandestine network so vast and so well connected, some believe it might have even hidden the Führer himself. Nazis on the run. In April 1945, over 1 million Soviet soldiers marched next to 20,000 tanks, pushing against the gates of Berlin and sending the last remnants of the Third Reich into retreat. Deep beneath the city, in the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler realized the collapse of his empire was inevitable. His armies were shattered, his allies gone, and the enemy was closing in from all sides. With the war lost and no escape in sight, Hitler chose to make the ultimate sacrifice over surrender, taking his life with a bullet alongside Eva Braun, his wife of one day. But the end of the Führer did not put an end to the invasion. Above the bunker, the Soviet assault reached the Reichstag, where fanatical Waffen-SS soldiers kept the fight alive until they ran out of munitions. Soviet troops cleared the building room by room until there was no German man left standing. Finally, on May 2nd, a red Soviet banner rose over the ruined dome. Berlin had fallen. But for the surviving Nazi elite, the battle wasn't over. Many of Hitler's top lieutenants had to make a decision: follow the Führer's footsteps and take their own lives, or vanish amid the chaos of Germany's collapse. Disguised as civilians, low-rank soldiers, or foreign laborers, they slipped through the ruins, desperate to evade justice. Among them was Heinrich Himmler, architect of the SS and overseer of the Holocaust. Using forged documents, he moved through Germany undetected. But before he could reach safety, Soviet patrols caught up with him, and soon he was in the hands of British intelligence. When his false identity crumbled under questioning, Himmler had no other option but to bite into the cyanide capsule he'd kept hidden within his mouth, escaping whatever punishment awaited him under a new Allied-occupied Germany. Other Nazis succumbed to violent executions by Soviet troops hungry for revenge. Others were dragged east to forced labor camps, and yet others were paraded in front of the world at the Nuremberg trials, where justice awaited them. The Allies hoped this would be the last chapter on Nazism, but it wasn't. As the courtroom filled with Third Reich collaborators, the absence of key figures was unmistakable. Soon, a chilling realization took hold: the Nazis had escaped. Somewhere, somehow, before Berlin burned, they had slipped away. The rat lines, as Allied intelligence would later uncover, had served as clandestine escape routes carved across Europe, helping the worst monsters of the Nazi regime to run away. Emergency exit. Even before the Reich fell under Allied firepower, Hitler's inner circle had begun to sense the inevitable. By 1944, before the Soviet tanks arrived in Berlin, the plan to stage a final escape had already begun. The escape routes were rapidly vanishing. The party's influence was disintegrating, collaborators scattered, and the entire continent had its weapons drawn against them. Still, there was one lifeline left. General Francisco Franco, Spain's fascist dictator, had long been a sympathizer of Hitler. Before World War II began, Nazi aircraft tested their weapons during the Spanish Civil War, bombing socialist towns like Guernica. Now, at war's end, Franco returned the favor by offering his country as a transitory haven for fleeing Nazis. For a brief time, Spanish towns and coastlines buzzed with whispers of war criminals passing through under false names, aided by sympathetic officers and carefully forged documents. But even Franco could not shelter them forever. As the Allies closed in and the world demanded justice, Spain could no longer openly shield its old friends. The fugitives understood that Europe was lost, and if they wanted true sanctuary, they would have to cross an ocean. Under President Juan Domingo Perón, Argentina became the endpoint of many escape routes. His admiration for Hitler was never subtle. About the post-war Nuremberg trials, Perón once declared, quote, "In Nuremberg, something was taking place that I personally considered a disgrace and an unfortunate lesson for the future of humanity." In Perón's Argentina, high-ranking war criminals were given new names, homes, and perhaps most crucially, a promise of no extradition, no matter how loudly the Allies demanded it. Reaching Argentina required the fugitives to seek help, and they found it in members of the Catholic Church who sympathized with their cause. It's estimated that up to 90% of escaping Nazis passed through Italy, often escorted by priests and bishops who helped war criminals pass as clergy, sneaking through the Alps, hiding in monasteries, and using forged Vatican papers to evade capture. For some, the journey was harrowing. Eduard Roschmann, also known as the Butcher of Riga for his role in overseeing some of the cruelest crimes of the Nazi regime, was initially sent to the former Dachau concentration camp, turned into a holding facility for Nazi officials after the war. But before he could be brought to justice, he escaped. When British guards spotted him near the Austrian border, they opened fire. A bullet reached him, but that didn't stop him. He vanished into the frozen wilderness. Roschmann managed to make it out alive, eventually reaching Italy, where, like many others, he disguised himself as a refugee, received a Red Cross passport, and boarded a ship under a false name. He was just one of thousands. Documents revealed decades later estimate that over 9,000 Nazis escaped Europe after the war, with at least 5,000 finding refuge in Argentina alone. An international conspiracy. Some believe the mass escape of Nazis after World War II was far too vast and synchronized to have been orchestrated by isolated agents working in secret. According to this theory, it was the result of a clandestine network stretching across continents and institutions, with ties that allegedly reached the highest levels of the Church. By 1946, American intelligence operatives began referring to a mysterious group known as Odessa, short for Organisation der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen, or Organization of Former SS Members. Over the decades, Odessa became a source of speculation, portrayed by investigators, journalists, and novelists as a brotherhood with a singular purpose: to smuggle war criminals out of Europe, rebuild the Nazi elite in exile, and perhaps one day resurrect the Reich. But what makes this theory even darker is its alleged connection to the Holy Father himself. According to some accounts, Pope Pius XI was not just aware of the so-called monastery route that ferried former SS officers through Catholic sanctuaries, but may have even endorsed it. According to these theories, the highest levels of the Vatican believed that relocating fervent nationalists across the world could serve as a way to fight against the growing threat of communism. However, to this day, no definitive proof of Pope Pius XI working alongside former Nazis or a centralized Odessa network has ever surfaced. Historian Daniel Stahl of Vienna's Friedrich Schiller University argues that, quote, "The rat lines were not a thoroughly structured system, but consisted of many individual components. It was more of a spontaneous cooperation of different institutions that gradually established itself after World War II." This absence of evidence has done little to silence the rumors. For decades, many have kept speculating that Odessa, or something like it, did exist, and that it wasn't just a network to save fugitives, but the machine that allowed Hitler himself to make it out of Germany alive. The Führer's last quest. After the Soviets took over Berlin, the troops marched to the Reich Chancellery Garden, just outside the Führer bunker. Word had already spread that Adolf Hitler had taken his own life, but the Red soldiers wanted proof. They began digging through the bomb-shattered earth of the garden, but all they found were scattered bones. Still, amid the graveyard, they recovered a partial jawbone with a gold dental bridge. This had to be it. The Soviets brought in Fritz Eckmann, Hitler's dentist, and his assistant, Katha Heusemann. As soon as Heusemann examined the dental fragment, she was sure, quote, "I was immediately able to identify the bridge from the upper jaw as well as the lower jawbone, belonging to Adolf Hitler." Still, not everyone appeared to be as convinced. Just 2 months later, as heads of state gathered at the Potsdam Conference to discuss the post-war order, U.S. Secretary of State James Burns turned to Stalin and asked how Hitler had truly passed away. The Soviet leader looked at him and dropped a bombshell. He believed Hitler's reported demise to be fake. The Führer was very much still alive, probably hiding somewhere in Spain or Argentina, That single declaration would haunt the Americans for years, with rumors about Hitler's alleged escape spreading across the world. U.S. intelligence took the threat seriously. Even before Germany fell, the Secret Service had drafted mock-ups of Hitler in disguise, altered with shaved mustaches, different hair, and wearing glasses, anticipating an escape effort. In the years that followed, declassified CIA and FBI files revealed that the agencies documented hundreds of supposed sightings. Among the most disturbing was a report by a supposed former SS soldier named Philip Citrone, who claimed to have met with Hitler in Colombia in the 1950s before the Führer moved to Argentina. He even presented a photograph of himself beside a man bearing an eerie resemblance to Hitler. Scribbled on the back was the name Adolf Schuttelmeyer. If Hitler had indeed escaped, it's unclear whether he did it using one of the rat lines passing through Franco's Spain, calling for the help of the Vatican, or traveling north, where extremist Finnish nationalists were also known for establishing networks of safe houses and naval transportation to get Germans out of the country. Some theorists have suggested that Hitler could have perhaps even taken a U-boat out of Germany and used a body double to stage his passing. According to these stories, he lived the rest of his days in South America, where he even had a daughter named Uschi. Yet the CIA remained unconvinced. These reports seemed far too unbelievable and not worth pursuing. Ultimately, they opted to shelve them and instead go after the fugitives they knew for a fact were alive and hiding. Hunting for Nazis. In the quiet suburbs of Queens, New York, the scent of simmering stew drifted across a modest house. It was the early 1960s, and Mrs. Ryan, a soft-spoken, polite woman, known for offering pancakes to the neighborhood kids, was preparing dinner before her husband returned home from work. Then the doorbell rang. She wiped her hands, walked to the front door, and opened it. On the other side stood several men in dark suits. There were no pleasantries. Mrs. Ryan didn't flinch. She looked the lead agent straight in the eye and muttered, quote, "I knew this would happen. You've come." The quiet housewife was not who she claimed to be. Her real name was Ermine Braunsteiner, a former SS guard at Ravensbrück and Majdanek, infamous among survivors for her extreme violence. At Majdanek, she'd spent nearly 2 decades hiding in the United States, married, naturalized, and almost forgotten. Yet she would become the first Nazi criminal to be extradited from the U.S. Following her trail was Simon Wiesenthal, once a talented architect. Wiesenthal lost everything when the Nazis came. He and his family were torn apart, scattered across camps and forced labor sites. But in 1945, when the gates of Mauthausen finally opened, Wiesenthal was still standing. 3 weeks after liberation, he began to compile a list of names. He limped alongside Allied officials, translating as they tracked down SS officers and interrogated survivors. He was determined to make the Nazis pay for their crimes. From a tiny 2-room office run on a shoestring budget, Wiesenthal launched what became one of the most relentless manhunts in modern history, helping to identify hundreds of Nazi fugitives, including Braunsteiner, living normal lives across Europe, the Americas, and the Middle East. Around the same time Braunsteiner was unmasked, Wiesenthal received a lead on a far more elusive figure, Franz Stangl, former commandant of Sobibor and Treblinka, camps that had no survivors by design. After the war, Stangl slipped past justice. With no witnesses left to testify, American interrogators failed to realize who he was, and he quickly vanished through the rat lines. It wouldn't be until decades later that he would surface again in Brazil. Wiesenthal tracked him patiently. He couldn't afford a misstep. Stangl had evaded capture once before. Over the years, Wiesenthal compiled a file, photographs, employment records, and travel documents, until finally, on February 28, 1967, Brazilian authorities stood before Stangl the moment he stepped out of his front door. His face paled and his hands trembled as he realized he'd been found. However, not every fugitive was an easy catch. Fugitive. At Auschwitz, Dr. Joseph Mengele sent thousands to their doom with a flick of his gloved hand. Those he spared suffered gruesome experiments aimed at testing Nazi weapons and taking the human body to its limit. After the war, his name was ever present during the Nuremberg trials. But when prosecutors asked where he was, officials presumed him lost to Allied gunfire in the chaos of Germany's collapse. But Simon Wiesenthal didn't buy it. He knew Mengele wasn't the kind of man who'd be taken out that easily. For years, the hunt dragged on. Rumors flowed in from every corner of the world. A man matching his description was spotted in the Greek Isles, in the hills of Spain, in a dusty village near the Nile. But every trail turned cold. Then came the breakthrough. Wiesenthal stumbled across an old Argentinian divorce filing. The name, Joseph Mengele, was printed in black and white next to an address. The hunter had finally found his prey. Wiesenthal followed the thread. Mengele had worked on farms in post-war Germany, blending in among ordinary civilians. Then, with forged papers, he slipped into Italy, boarded a ship, and crossed the Atlantic. In Argentina, he assumed a new life as a carpenter. But whispers spread that he was still practicing medicine in the shadows as a black market doctor. It's even said that one young patient was lost on his table. Wiesenthal handed the intelligence to the Israeli Mossad, the country's national intelligence agency, and they launched a covert operation. Spies landed in Argentina. They stalked the address, waiting for the Auschwitz doctor to step out. One of the agents later recalled, quote, "It was decided to make a commando raid, but Mengele wasn't there anymore. We now know he had fled in 1959. They were too late. Mengele had slipped into Paraguay and then Brazil, constantly moving. Still, Wiesenthal and the Israelis refused to stop. They plastered posters across South America with Joseph Mengele's face next to the headline, "World's Most Wanted Assassin." Wiesenthal himself offered a $100,000 bounty. Undercover agents walked around markets and asked for Mengele in cafes, checking registers in clinics and cemeteries. But Mengele would always vanish before the hunters could get to him. In the end, there was no grand arrest. Mengele passed away at the age of 67 in a small Brazilian beach town. He suffered a heart attack while swimming and drowned. The body was buried under a false name, Wolfgang Gerhard, until DNA tests confirmed his identity years later. Target secured. No matter how many evaded capture, the Nazi hunters had made sure that these fleeing criminals never felt safe again and kept on chasing them. In 1960, the search led them once more to a quiet neighborhood in Buenos Aires. That's where Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust logistics, was hiding with his family. Wiesenthal's early leads had helped point Mossad director Isser Harel to Eichmann, now living under the alias Ricardo Klement, working a simple job at a local Mercedes-Benz factory and blending into the suburb of San Fernando. The risk was enormous. Many within the Argentinian government were sympathetic to the Nazi cause, and any formal request for extradition would almost certainly be rejected, and worse, it could even trigger Eichmann's immediate disappearance. So Mossad made its decision. Eichmann would be taken, covertly, by force. A strike team of 8 agents was deployed to Argentina. For weeks, they hid in the shadows, stalking their target day and night. They followed him home from work, photographed him, memorizing every step of his daily routine. The trap was set, and on the evening of May 11th, 1960, as Eichmann stepped off the bus and began his short walk home, a Mossad agent approached and asked him a question in Spanish. Eichmann froze, but before he could step back, 2 other agents closed around him. One wrapped his arms around Eichmann's chest, pinning his arms, while the other tackled his legs. The former SS officer hit the ground hard, struggling to make a sound as he was thrown into a waiting van. For the next 9 days, he was held in a safe house as the agents prepared for their escape. They dyed Eichmann's hair, glued on a false mustache, and dressed him in the uniform of an El Al airline crew member. Meanwhile, they forged Israeli travel documents, bearing a new identity. But they couldn't risk Eichmann fighting back or crying out before boarding the plane and blowing his cover before Argentinian officers. So when the time came, one of the agents injected him with a sedative. Groggy and glassy-eyed, he was wheeled onto the plane, right under the watchful eyes of the local police. The ruse worked, and on May 23, 1960, Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion made the historic announcement on a TV broadcast, declaring, quote, "Israeli security services have captured one of the greatest Nazi war criminals, Adolf Eichmann." His trial was the first time many would hear the Holocaust described in vivid detail from the victims themselves. Broadcast globally, survivors recounted how Eichmann organized the trains that delivered millions to the camps. Yet he showed no remorse, stating, quote, "There's a need to draw a line between the leaders responsible and the people like me, forced to serve as mere instruments in the hands of the leaders. I was not a responsible leader, and as such do not feel guilty." Still, he was found guilty of his crimes, and on June 1st, 1962, Eichmann's escape had come to a definitive end. Release. According to historical estimates, over 67,000 suspected Nazi war criminals were never found, their final whereabouts still unknown to this day, suggesting that the post-war Nazi migration to foreign countries was far greater than anyone could have imagined. And although these are most likely gone, the hunt for them continues to this day. In early 2025, Argentinian President Javier Milei announced the declassification of long-held documents from the nation's defense ministry. These records reportedly contain evidence of financial support provided to establish and sustain the escape networks that shielded Nazi fugitives. While many of the fugitive Nazi war criminals will never be tried, these documents could offer the full truth about their escape routes and post-war lives, revealing how some of the worst Nazis among Hitler's ranks managed to disappear after the war, and exactly who helped to keep them hidden for so long.